The gavel came down so hard it cracked the edge of Harlan Pruitt's good oak table, and Theodora Keller did not flinch. Not once. Not even when the 5 men seated before her in the Caldwell Creek town hall erupted into laughter that scraped against the low-beamed ceiling like boots on gravel. She stood perfectly still, her architectural drawings rolled under her arm, her jaw set, her dark eyes moving from one face to the next with the calm precision of a woman who had already decided that this meeting was not the end of anything. "The proposal," said Harlan Pruitt, who served as both council chairman and the town's most profitable saloon owner, "is denied. Unanimously. Miss Keller, I suggest you redirect your considerable energies toward matters more befitting your station." "And what station would that be?" Theodora asked. Her voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that made men lean forward even when they didn't want to. Harlan smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "The domestic kind." The room laughed again. All 5 of them. Gerald Finch, who owned the feed store, Ezra Dunmore, who ran the telegraph office, Samuel Voss, who controlled the land office and half the deeds in the county, Augustus Laney, who had arrived from St. Louis 2 years ago with a bankroll and a practiced air of authority. And Harlan, always Harlan, watching her with that particular brand of amusement that men wore when they were trying to hide the fact that someone had frightened them. Theodora looked at each of them one final time. She tucked her drawings more firmly under her arm, picked up her hat from the corner of the desk where she had placed it when she entered, and walked out the door without another word. The night air of Caldwell Creek, Kansas hit her face, cool and smelling of horses and dust, and the distant sweetness of summer grass. It was June of 1878, and the prairie beyond the town's edge was gold and vast, and completely indifferent to the ambitions of 5 small men in a small room. She stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the town hall, breathing slowly, listening to the muffled laughter that followed her through the closed door. There were 19 children in Caldwell Creek who had not attended a single day of formal school in the last 2 years, because the previous schoolteacher had married a rancher from Abilene, and the building she had used, a rented back room in the old druggist's shop, had since been converted into a storage space for Gerald Finch's surplus grain sacks. 19 children. She knew all their names. She knew their ages and their circumstances and the particular brightness that lived in their eyes when someone sat down beside them and explained how numbers worked or read aloud from a proper book. That was what she had asked for. A piece of town land, 50 feet by 60 feet, on the eastern edge of the main street where the lot sat empty and weedy and useless. A place to build a schoolhouse. She had submitted drawings, materials, estimates, a budget down to the last nail. She had calculated load-bearing requirements for the walls and roof, accounting for the weight of Kansas snowfall in January and the lateral force of the prairie wind that came screaming out of the northwest every October. She had done everything correctly, and they had laughed at her. Theodora Keller was 28 years old. She had been homesteading alone on 160 acres, 12 miles east of Caldwell Creek for 4 years, since her father died of influenza, and left her the claim and a mule named Bernard, and approximately $47 in coin buried in a tin beneath the floorboard of the root cellar. In those 4 years she had learned to do everything herself, because there was no one else. She had learned carpentry from her father's books and from necessity, and she had built her own barn when the original one collapsed in a windstorm in the autumn of 1875. She had learned surveying from a borrowed manual, and had staked her own fence lines with such precision that, when the county assessor came out in 1876, he had checked her stakes 3 times before admitting they were perfect. She raised wheat and a kitchen garden and a small herd of 6 milk cows, and she had turned a profit 2 years running. None of that had mattered to the town council of Caldwell Creek tonight. What mattered to them was that she was a woman, unmarried, with no husband's name to put in front of hers and no powerful man standing behind her to give her proposal the gravity they thought it required. She walked to her wagon, untied her horse, and sat for a long moment on the wagon seat looking up at the spray of stars above the Kansas plains. The Milky Way was enormous tonight, a river of cold fire from one horizon to the other. She made a decision. If they would not give her the town land, she would use her own. She had a corner of her homestead claim that sat close enough to the creek road to be accessible. It was further from town than she wanted, but children could walk. Children had been walking to things since the beginning of time. She would build the schoolhouse herself, on her own land, with her own lumber, with her own hands and whatever help she could gather. She would not ask the council for one single thing ever again. The wagon rolled east under the stars, Bernard's hooves a soft rhythm on the packed dirt road, and Theodora was already doing mathematics in her head. She had been back on her homestead for 3 days, working her calculations by lamplight each evening after the cows were in, and the supper dishes washed, when Clyde Turner rode up her lane on a brown and white paint horse and stopped at a respectful distance from her front porch, as men with good manners did. She was outside when he arrived, not on the porch but around the side of the house, measuring and staking a line in the dirt with a wooden stake and a length of cord. She heard the horse and straightened, her hand going automatically to the knife at her belt, which was the reflex of a woman alone on a homestead, before she assessed the rider and relaxed fractionally. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than the deliberate cultivation of it. His hat was beaten by weather and honest use. His face, when he pushed the brim up slightly to look at her, was angular and sun-darkened, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green she associated with the sky right before a hailstorm. He looked to be somewhere around 32 or 33. He rode with the easy, unconscious competence of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. "Miss Keller," he said. "That's right," she said. She did not put down her measuring cord. "My name is Clyde Turner. I run the Turner outfit about 8 miles north of you. I heard about what happened at the town council meeting 3 nights ago." "Apparently everyone did," she said. "News travels fast in a small town. What can I do for you, Mr. Turner?" He paused, and she noticed that he was looking at the stakes she had driven into the ground, at the cord she was using to establish her lines, at the orientation of it all relative to the road and the creek and the morning sun. Something shifted in his expression, not the condescension she had braced for but something more careful than that. "I came to offer help," he said, "if you'll have it." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" "Because I've got 2 boys," he said, 8 and 11, and they've got no school to go to. Their mother taught them their letters before she passed, but she's been gone 3 years and I don't have her gift for it, and I can't afford to send them to Wichita or Abilene just for schooling." He paused again. "I heard you were going to build one yourself. I heard you know how to do it." "I have lumber from a barn I took down last spring that I haven't found a use for yet, and I have 2 strong hands and enough time to lend them, if you'll tell me where to put them." Theodora studied him for a moment that stretched out between them like the measuring cord she still held. She was accustomed to men offering help in the way that men often did on the frontier, which was to say as a prelude to taking over, to redirecting, to deciding they knew better, to the slow erasure of her authority over her own project, until suddenly it was their project and she was an observer. She had experienced this before, with a neighboring farmer named Willis who had offered to help her repair her fence line, and had ended up spending 3 days rearranging her whole property layout according to his own theories while she stood by grinding her back teeth. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully. "Before I accept it, I need to be very clear about something. This is my project. I designed it. I will make all decisions about construction materials and method. If you want to help, you work under my direction, not beside it and not above it. If that arrangement suits you, you're welcome here. If it doesn't, I understand completely and I wish you well." There was a pause. Clyde Turner looked at her for a long moment and she watched something move across his face that she could not quite name. It was not offense. It was something more like recalibration. "That suits me fine," he said. She believed him because his voice was the same at the end of that sentence as it had been at the beginning, without the tightening that men often had when they agreed to something they didn't actually agree to. "All right," she said. "Get down and I'll show you the site." She turned and walked toward the staked area, and after a moment she heard him dismount and follow, his boots landing solidly on the summer-dry ground. The building site was a level piece of ground about 400 feet from her farmhouse, in the corner of her claim that faced the creek road. She had chosen it for 3 reasons. First, the ground was naturally level and firm, not prone to the seasonal wet that plagued the lower quarter of her acreage. Second, the orientation allowed for windows on the south and east walls, which meant good natural light during morning lessons and afternoon reading without the brutal afternoon glare from the west. Third, the mature cottonwood trees along the creek edge to the north would act as a windbreak in winter without blocking any useful light. She explained all of this to Clyde Turner as she walked him around the staked perimeter, and she watched his face as she talked. He listened. This was already distinguishing him from most men of her acquaintance. He listened and he looked at what she pointed to and he nodded, and when she explained the load-bearing calculation she had done for the roof pitch he asked a question. "You pitched it steeper than most houses around here," he said. 13 and 12 if I'm reading your stakes right. That's nearly 47 degrees. She stopped and looked at him, slightly surprised that he had been reading the stakes while she talked, and more surprised that he had done the angle calculation in his head from the rise and run marks she had driven. "That's right," she said. "For the snow load," he said. "And the wind," she said. "A lower pitch catches wind like a sail. A steeper pitch lets it pass over." He nodded slowly, looking at her staking with a new quality of attention. "Where did you learn roof pitch engineering?" "Books," she said. "And the first barn I built sat with a low-pitched roof through one Kansas winter, and then the January blizzard of 1876 put 3 feet of snow on it, and the roof sagged 6 inches in one night. I tore it down and rebuilt it the next spring with what I should have done the first time." He was quiet for a moment. Most men who built a barn wrong would find a way to convince themselves it hadn't been wrong. "I'm not most men," she said. She had meant it to be dry and factual, and she heard it come out that way, and then she noticed the corner of his mouth move in something that was nearly a smile. "No," he said. "I can see that." They talked for another hour about the project. She showed him her drawings, spread across the hood of her wagon in the afternoon light, and she watched him study them with real concentration. He was not a trained builder, but he had built a great deal in his life, as men on the frontier all did, and he understood construction logic. He pointed to her footing plan and asked about the frost line, and she told him she was going to dig to 36 inches, 4 inches deeper than the standard practice, because the ground on her claim was sandier than most and she wanted extra insurance against frost heave. "That's a lot of extra digging," he said. "Yes," she said. "It will last longer." He nodded. No argument. She found herself revising her initial assessment of him upward by several degrees. He came back the next morning with his 2 boys and a wagon loaded with lumber. The lumber was good quality, straight-grained and well-dried, genuine white oak planks from the barn he'd spoken of, and Theodora ran her hand along a board's face and felt the quality of it, and acknowledged to herself that this was a significant contribution. Clyde's boys were named Marcus and Peter. Marcus was the 11-year-old, dark-haired and quiet and observant in a way that reminded her of someone cataloging information rather than receiving it. Peter was the 8-year-old, red-haired and energetic, and inclined to touch everything within arm's reach. They were both polite in the direct, slightly formal way of children who had been raised by a single father doing his best, and Theodora liked them immediately. She put Marcus to work sorting and stacking lumber by dimension, which was a task requiring attention to detail and systematic thinking, and she saw the way he took to it. She put Peter to work carrying water from the creek for the concrete mixture she would need. which burned his energy usefully while keeping him from the parts of the site where mistakes would be costly. She put Clyde to work with a shovel, digging the first footing trench along the north wall, which she had staked with a precision that he commented on after the first hour. "These stakes are exact," he said, straightening from the trench and wiping his face with his forearm. "I've helped build 4 or 5 things out here, and I've never seen staking this clean. The stakes are only as good as the measurements behind them," she said. She was mixing a test batch of concrete in a wooden trough, checking the ratio of lime and sand and aggregate she was using. If the foundation is wrong, everything built on top of it is wrong. You can't correct a foundation error with carpentry. He looked at her for a moment. "Did you survey this yourself?" "Yes," she said. "I have a transit level. I borrowed it from a civil engineer who came through 3 years ago to survey the creek road. I kept it long enough to teach myself to use it properly, then returned it with a pie." He laughed at that, a genuine laugh that came out of him without ceremony, and it was a good sound. It was not the laughing at her sound she had been hearing all week from the men in the town hall. It was the laughing with sound, the kind that meant someone found something genuinely delightful about the world. She went back to her concrete mix. The work settled into a rhythm over the following days. Clyde came every morning with his boys, arriving before the heat of the day. They dug footings and mixed concrete and hauled timber and drove stakes, and Theodora directed all of it from the center of the site, moving from task to task with the authority of someone who had studied every detail and thought through every contingency. She made decisions quickly, and they were consistently good decisions, and Clyde Turner noticed this without making a production of it, which she also noticed. On the 4th day of work, a man named Ezra Dunmore rode out from town. He was one of the 5 council members who had laughed at her. He sat on his horse at the edge of her property and called out to her in his official voice, the one he used when he wanted to sound like the telegraph office gave him legal authority. "Miss Keller, I've come to advise you that the town council has some concerns about this construction." Theodora put down her hammer, which she had been using to pin a joist hanger, and walked to where Dunmore sat. Clyde had stopped working too, and she was aware of him standing behind her and to her right, though he did not move forward. "What concerns would those be?" she said. "The question of whether a woman alone can legitimately establish a school on homestead land without proper authorization," Dunmore said. "There are legal questions. The Homestead Act of 1862 grants me full rights to improve and develop my claim in any lawful manner I choose," Theodora said. "A schoolhouse is a lawful improvement. I am not asking for public funding or public land. I am building on my own property at my own expense with my own materials. The town council has no jurisdiction over what I do on my own claim." Dunmore blinked. He had clearly expected more uncertainty from her, more deference. "Nevertheless, there are precedents to consider." "Name one," she said. There was a silence. "Name one legal precedent by which a municipality can prevent a landowner from erecting a private educational building on their own property," she said. "If you can name one, I will stop construction and go to Wichita and research it myself. If you cannot, I would ask you to remove yourself from the edge of my land, Mr. Dunmore, as you are blocking the light from my south wall staking." Dunmore's face went red. He looked at her, then past her at Clyde Turner, who was standing with his arms crossed and an expression of complete neutrality on his face. Dunmore opened his mouth, closed it, turned his horse, and rode back toward town. Theodora turned back to the building site. Clyde was watching her, and his expression had shifted into something she had not seen on his face before. It was a kind of arrested attention, as though he had just seen something unexpected happen and was still in the process of understanding what it was. "He'll be back," Clyde said. "Probably," she said. "With different arguments. I'll handle those too." She picked up her hammer. "Can you hold the other end of this joist hanger while I pin it? I need a second pair of hands." He came over and held the hanger steady, his hands large and sure against the wood, and she drove the pins precisely and efficiently, and neither of them mentioned Dunmore again. The days moved. The footings cured slowly in the summer heat, and while they cured, she and Clyde worked on cutting and assembling the wall frame sections on flat ground where they could be laid out precisely and checked with a square before being raised. She had a good carpenter's square and a folding rule, and she used both constantly, checking her angles with a rigor that Clyde came to understand was not compulsion but engineering discipline. He had worked with men who built by eye and by approximation, and the results were structures that leaned slightly and settled unevenly and required constant maintenance. Theodora's work had a different quality. Everything was exactly what she said it would be. He noticed, on the sixth day, that she had been working since before he arrived each morning and was still working after he left each evening. He could see the lamplight in her farmhouse window late into the night as he rode home, and he found himself looking for it, that small, warm square of light in the dark prairie, and he did not immediately examine why. On the eighth evening he stayed later than usual, working on the sill plates while the light lasted. Theodora was working beside him, and Marcus was nearby reading a book she had lent him from her own shelf, and Peter had fallen asleep in the back of Clyde's wagon with his hat over his face. The sun had just gone behind the western horizon, and the sky above the prairie was the color of apricots and ash, and the air had cooled enough to make the labor pleasant. "Can I ask you something?" Clyde said. "Yes," she said, without looking up from her work. "Did you always know how to do all this? The building and the surveying and the calculations?" She was quiet for a moment, fitting a sill plate notch. "No, I learned it because I needed to. My father was a schoolteacher himself. He understood books and ideas very well, but he was not a builder. When he got the homestead claim in 1872, we hired men to build the house and the first barn, and then he got sick and the money ran out and I had to figure out the rest myself." She paused. "The first thing I built entirely on my own was the smokehouse in the winter of 1874. It was terrible. The door didn't hang right and the smoke went everywhere but out the chimney. I tore it down and built it again correctly in the spring." "You tore it down yourself." "It was easier than living with it wrong." He looked at her profile in the evening light, this woman beside him with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and sawdust in her hair, and a carpenter's pencil tucked behind her ear, and he felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. He had been a widower for 3 years. His wife Clara had died of a fever in the spring of 1875, and the grief of it had occupied him so completely that he had become, for a long while, essentially just a function. A man who fed animals and raised children and planted and harvested and survived, but who existed in a kind of gray envelope that kept the world at a slight remove. He had not been lonely in the way people meant when they used that word, because he had his boys and he had the land, but something had been quiet in him for a long time. Sitting beside Theodora Keller in the copper light of a Kansas evening, with the smell of cut lumber and prairie grass around him, and the sound of his younger son breathing in his sleep in the wagon nearby, he was aware that something had stopped being quiet. He did not say any of this. He was not a man who said things before he understood them. "Your father was a schoolteacher," he said instead. "Is that why the school matters so much to you?" She was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice had a different quality, something more private than her usual directness. "He always said that what you know is the only thing that truly belongs to you. Land can be taken. Money can be lost. A person's health can fail. But what you have genuinely learned and understood, what you have made part of the way you see and think, that cannot be taken from you." She set the sill plate in its position and reached for her pencil to mark it. 19 children in Caldwell Creek don't have that yet. I can give it to them." He watched her mark the wood with a steady hand. "And you don't need the council's permission to do it," he said. "No," she said, "I don't." They worked in companionable silence until the light was truly gone, and then she lit a lantern and they worked a little longer, and he was aware that he didn't want to leave, which was new and notable. On the 14th day, Harlan Pruitt himself rode out to the building site, and he did not come alone. He brought Samuel Voss, who controlled the land office, and a man Theodora did not recognize at first, a man in a dark suit with a leather satchel, who turned out to be a lawyer named Corbett from Wichita. Theodora had just finished laying out the first course of the east wall when they arrived, and she looked up and saw the three of them and understood immediately that the stakes had been raised. Clyde was working on the roof truss assembly 20 feet away. He saw the visitors too, and he put down his work and stood, watching. Harlan dismounted with the theatricality of a man who believed he was important. Lawyer Corbett did not dismount, which told Theodora he was not fully committed to whatever position he was about to put forward. "Miss Keller," said Harlan, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to end this voluntarily and preserve your dignity." "My dignity is in fine condition," she said. "What is your claim, Mr. Pruitt?" Harlan gestured to Samuel Voss, who stepped forward with a paper. "The original land grant for this homestead claim," Voss said in his careful official voice, "contains a covenant from the territorial period specifying that the land may not be used for commercial or institutional purposes without municipal approval. Building a school constitutes an institutional use." This was the trap. This was what they had been preparing in the 2 weeks since she had started building. She looked at the paper in Voss's hand, and her mind moved through it rapidly. "May I read that?" she said. Voss handed it to her because refusing would have made it look fraudulent. She read it carefully, the whole document, while Harlan watched with the satisfied expression of a man holding what he believed to be a winning card. The lawyer on his horse looked slightly uncomfortable. Clyde had drifted closer, not intrusively but noticeably. She read it twice. Then she handed it back to Voss. "The covenant you're referencing is in paragraph 4, she said. "It applies to commercial or institutional uses of the land undertaken for profit or for the benefit of individuals other than the claim holder and their family." She looked at Harlan directly. "I am building a school on my own land that I intend to operate free of charge. There is no commercial transaction involved, no fees collected, no institutional charter. It is a private facility I am making available to the community as a landowner's right, the same way any homesteader can invite their neighbors to gather on their property for church services or community events." She paused. "Your lawyer knows this. Ask him." There was a silence. Harlan looked at Corbett. Corbett had the expression of a man who wished he were somewhere else. "She has a point," Corbett said quietly. "The covenant language wouldn't cover a free, privately operated educational gathering on private land." Harlan's jaw went tight. "There has to be some angle," he said to Corbett in a voice that was not quiet enough to be private. "Not that I can see," Corbett said. Theodora picked up her trowel. "Good day, Mr. Pruitt," she said and turned back to her wall. She heard them mount and ride away. She concentrated on her mortar, which was the correct consistency and needed her attention. After a moment she heard Clyde's boots approach and then stop behind her. "That was something," he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. It was softer than usual, and something in it went slightly unsteady. "Legal documents generally say what they say," she said. "You had that whole covenant in your head," he said. "Paragraph 4. You read it twice and you had it memorized." "I read it once to understand it," she said, "and once to confirm I had understood it correctly." She smoothed mortar with her trowel. "I memorized the Homestead Act 2 years ago. I memorized the original land grant conditions for this claim when I took possession of it. Knowledge is preparation, Mr. Turner. I knew someone would come with a legal argument eventually. I prepared for it." She heard him exhale, a long, slow breath. When she glanced back at him, his eyes were wide, and his expression was one she could only describe as genuinely stunned. Not the condescending surprise of a man who hadn't expected a woman to be competent. Something bigger than that. The look of someone who has encountered a thing that reorganizes their understanding of the world somewhat. "My God," he said softly, and she thought he hadn't meant to say it out loud. She turned back to her wall, but she felt warmth in her face that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. That evening he did not go home at the usual time. He sent his boys home with the wagon, telling Marcus to make supper from the cold biscuits and the smoked ham in the kitchen, and stayed to help Theodora complete the east wall's first course, which needed to be done before the mortar from the morning's mix dried out of the joints she'd left half-filled. They worked without talking much, the comfortable kind of silence that settles between people when they have decided to trust each other. The prairie evening came in around them, the grasshoppers making their racket in the long grass and a nighthawk crying somewhere above them in the purple sky. "Why does Harlan Pruitt want to stop you so badly?" Clyde asked at last. He had been wondering about it for days. Theodora set a brick with careful alignment. "Because educated people are harder to control," she said. "Harlan's saloon does very well with men who don't have much else to do and who don't have the tools to build anything for themselves. An educated community eventually wants better things, better government, better accountability, better understanding of their own legal rights." She paused. "He's not stupid. He understands exactly what a schoolhouse represents. He just thinks his interests matter more than 19 children's futures." Clyde was quiet for a while. "He's been running this town for a long time," he said, "since before I got here." "When did you come here?" 1872. "Same year as your father's claim, I think. I came from Missouri. My wife Clara was from a farming family in Sedalia." He stopped and she heard him recalibrate quietly. "She always said Kansas was too flat and too far and too lonesome, but she came anyway." He said a brick. "She was brave, braver than she got credit for." "What was she like?" Theodora asked. She did not usually ask personal questions, but she found she wanted to understand this man more fully. "Soft-spoken," he said, "which people mistook for meek, but she wasn't meek. She was the kind of person who decided things quietly and then simply lived by her decisions, without announcing them to anyone. She taught herself to speak some Cheyenne from a woman at the neighboring claim, because she said it was rude to live near people whose language you couldn't speak a word of." He smiled at the brick in his hand. "She was the one who taught Marcus to read. She'd sit with him every evening by the lamp, going through whatever book she could get from the church lending shelf. He was 7 when she got sick. He read her the last 2 chapters of Oliver Twist while she was in bed, because she wanted to know how it ended, and she knew she wasn't going to be able to finish it herself." Theodora's throat tightened. She set her own brick carefully and did not say anything for a moment. "He sounds like he got her gift for it," she said at last. "He did," Clyde said, "and he needs someone to teach him what to do with it. That's the truth of why I came out here the first morning. Not just because I wanted help with my boys, though that's true too, but because I saw what you were doing and I understood that you were doing something worth doing and I wanted to be part of it." She looked at him. He was watching her, and his gray-green eyes in the last of the light were very direct and very honest. "Thank you," she said. It came out simply, without the defensive armor she usually carried. He nodded and looked back at his work, and they continued in the good silence until full dark made it impossible. 3 weeks into construction, Theodora had an unexpected ally. The woman's name was Beatrice Holt, who was 42 and the wife of the blacksmith, and she arrived one morning with 4 loaves of bread and a fierce expression, and announced that she had heard about the project and wanted to contribute. Behind her came her eldest daughter Ruth, who was 16 and strong, and 2 of the other women from the settlement east of town, a Swede named Ingrid Carlson and a quiet woman named Dolores Reyes, who spoke little English, but had built half the structures on her family's claim and understood construction instinctively. Theodora welcomed them all. The work accelerated noticeably with additional hands, and something shifted in the atmosphere of the site that was harder to define. It became a community project, not by the decision of any committee or council, but organically because people who understood its value showed up. Clyde watched Theodora manage this expanded team with the same efficient clarity with which she had directed him, delegating tasks according to each person's ability, checking work without condescension, explaining her reasoning when she redirected someone. He noticed that the women responded to her the way he had come to respond to her, which was with respect that came from evidence rather than assumption. She earned it continuously. Harlan Pruitt made one more attempt to interfere, this time through a deputy named Collins who had been recently hired, and who arrived with a letter supposedly from the county sheriff, advising that the construction violated some building ordinance. Theodora read the letter, asked Collins to wait, went inside her farmhouse, returned with a copy of the county ordinance code she had obtained from Wichita, and showed him the relevant section, which pertained only to structures within the town limits. Her land was 12 miles outside the town limits. Collins looked at the ordinance code, looked at the letter he'd been given, and said he would report back to the sheriff and departed with some haste, looking as though he had realized he had been given bad information by someone who had expected him not to be checked. She did not hear from the county sheriff after that. She suspected Collins had told him what had happened, and the sheriff, who was a practical man with no personal stake in Harlan Pruitt's interests, had decided not to pursue a fight he would lose. The walls went up on a clear August morning, all 4 of them in a single long day that began at first light and ended with the last rafter plate being secured just as the sun went orange and enormous on the western edge of the world. Clyde drove the last pin on the northwest corner post and straightened up and looked at what they had built, the 4 walls standing clean and square and strong on their deep-laid footings, and he shook his head slowly. "It's true to plan," he said. "Every corner, every wall height, it's exactly as you drew it." "That's the point of a drawing," Theodora said. She was tired in a way that went into her bones, and her arms ached and her hands were rough with work. But she was looking at those walls with an expression that Clyde found he couldn't look away from because it was one of the truest things he'd ever seen on a person's face. Pure satisfaction earned. "You're something, Theodora Keller," he said. He hadn't used her first name before, and it came out before he had weighed whether to say it, and he heard it land in the air between them. She looked at him. There was a moment that was neither short nor long but was complete, in which they were simply looking at each other over the walls of the schoolhouse they had built, with the dust of the day on them and the last light of the summer evening turning everything to copper and gold. "Thank you," she said again, but the way she said it this time was different from the way she'd said it 3 weeks before. There was less armor in it. There was something open in it that she was allowing him to see. He wanted to say something more. He was not certain what. He was still working out the territory of his own feelings, which had been shifting under him like clay ground in spring, foundations he'd thought were settled revealing new depths. Beatrice Holt appeared from around the corner of the south wall with a jug of switchel she had mixed that morning, and the moment broke apart gently, the way good things sometimes do, not destroyed but simply deferred. The roof went up over the following week. Clyde had recruited 2 of his ranch hands for the heavy beam work, men named Garrett and Tolley who were experienced with timber framing, and who arrived with their hats in their hands, and a respectful manner that told Theodora Clyde had already briefed them on whose project this was. The steep pitch she designed was more work to frame than a shallow roof would have been, but Clyde's lumber was good and straight, and the framing went cleanly. She checked every rafter angle herself with her square and made 2 small corrections and found the rest perfect, which she said so, because she believed in noting accuracy as well as error. On the 3rd day of roof framing, a thing happened that no one had planned for. Peter, who was 8 and energetic, and inclined to treat the building site as a personal adventure park despite repeated instruction, climbed up onto the lowest roof rafter for reasons known only to himself, slipped on the smooth oak surface, and would have fallen 10 feet to the hard-packed ground below if Clyde had not crossed the entire width of the building in what Theodora would later describe as an almost unbelievable speed, caught the boy's arm at the last possible instant, and pulled him to safety with a controlled strength that left neither of them on the ground. Peter was unhurt and extremely frightened and crying. Clyde held him and said quiet things into his red hair, and Theodora stood very still watching a father hold his son, and something in her chest did an entirely unexpected thing. It ached, not in a sad way, in the way that beauty sometimes ached when it caught you without warning. She went to where they were and crouched down to Peter's level and said, "Are you hurt anywhere?" Peter shook his head and looked at her with wet eyes. "Good," she said. "Being scared is allowed. Being hurt is something we try to prevent. This is why we have the rules about the elevated sections." She looked at him steadily. "Would you like to come back and be useful again tomorrow, or would you like to wait until the roof is finished and closed in before you return?" Peter thought about it very seriously. "Tomorrow," he said. "Then tomorrow you will stay on the ground and hand materials up rather than climbing," she said. "Does that sound fair?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. She stood up. Clyde was looking at her over Peter's head, and his expression had the same quality it had worn when she had faced down Harlan's lawyer on the property line. Something large and genuine that he was not attempting to conceal. She went back to her work, her heart beating more than it should have been. The roof was clad, and the windows were cut and framed within another 10 days. Theodora had ordered window glass from the supplier in Wichita 3 weeks before construction began, and it arrived on the stage in carefully packed wooden crates, and she and Clyde installed the panes together on an overcast morning when the light was flat and even and showed the glazing work clearly. She showed him how to run the window putty with a consistent bevel to seal the glass against the frame, which was a thing he'd never learned to do properly, and he was an attentive student. "You're a good learner," she told him, watching him finish the last lower pane with a neat, even bead. "I had a good teacher," he said, and he said it the same way she had twice said thank you, with something open in it that he was allowing her to see. She looked at the window. The glass was perfectly set, no bubbles, no gaps. "The best thing about learning," she said, "is that once you understand the principle behind a thing, you can apply it to anything else. The principle of a well-sealed window is the same as the principle of a well-solved problem. You understand the boundary conditions, you work from the inside out, and you verify your result. Is that how you approach problems?" he said. "Always," she said. "Is that how you'd approach?" he began and then stopped. He was looking at her window, and his jaw had a quality of deliberate stillness that she recognized as a person editing themselves. "How I would approach what?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Never mind." But she saw his ears redden slightly, and she filed the moment away and thought about it later with a careful attention she applied to interesting data. The schoolhouse was complete on the 1st of September, 1878, a Saturday, which was 3 months and 1 week after the night the town council had laughed her out of the meeting hall. It was a sound, well-built structure with 4 walls, a steep pitched roof, 6 south-facing and east-facing windows for good light, a solid oak plank floor, a cast-iron wood stove that Beatrice's husband Frank had donated from his blacksmith shop, and enough bench seating for 30 children, which Clyde and his hands had built from the remaining white oak lumber. Theodora had made the teacher's desk herself, during the evenings over the previous week, from planks she had saved specifically for it, and it was a piece of clean, honest furniture that sat at the front of the room with a quiet authority. Beatrice Holt organized a gathering for the completion day that she called a viewing, because calling it a party seemed too trivial for what the building represented. Families came from 12 miles in every direction on the Creek Road and the North Track, arriving in wagons and on horseback, children running ahead, and then stopping to stare at the building as though they hadn't fully believed it until they could see it standing. There were 23 children in total who came with their families, and 19 of them were from Caldwell Creek or the surrounding claims. Ingrid Carlson baked a cake with dried apricots. Dollars Ray's brought a dish of rice and beans cooked with green peppers that was the best thing Clyde had eaten in recent memory. People stood in the classroom and ran their hands along the smooth-planed window frames and looked up at the steep-pitched ceiling and said things in quiet voices that were the kinds of things people say when they are standing inside something that matters. Marcus Turner sat at one of the student benches and opened the book he had brought, which was Theodora's copy of a geography text she had lent him 2 weeks before, and he read it in the middle of all the people talking around him, with the absorbed concentration of someone who existed in the book more fully than anywhere else. Theodora watched him from the doorway and felt the feeling she had been building toward all summer settle into its proper shape. This was why. This was the entirety of the reason. She became aware that Clyde was standing beside her, slightly behind her, in the doorway. She had become comfortable with his presence in a way that had happened so gradually she hadn't tracked it clearly, and now he was simply there in the way that things one depends on are simply there, and she noticed the quality of it. "You did this," he said softly. "We did this," she said. "No," he said. "I helped, but this started in your head and it stands because you refused to put it anywhere else. That was you." She looked at Marcus and his bench. Then she turned slightly and looked at Clyde Turner, whose gray-green eyes were warm and direct, and looking at her with something so uncomplicated in its honesty that it startled her. "Clyde," she said. "Theodora," he said. They were standing very close together in the schoolhouse doorway, the sound of the gathering flowing around them. Her heart was doing the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency when he was near her, which was beating with an emphasis she associated with important information. "You said something about a week ago," she said. "You started a sentence and stopped. Is that how you would approach, and then you didn't finish it?" His ears went slightly red again, which she had learned was his version of a tell. "I remember," he said. "Will you finish it now?" He looked at her for a long moment. The gathering hummed around them. Peter had attached himself to Ingrid Carlson's youngest daughter in the far corner, and they were playing some kind of game involving a piece of string. Marcus was still reading. "I was going to ask," Clyde said, carefully and quietly, "if that is how you would approach something like getting to know a person, understanding the boundary conditions, working from the inside out." She felt warmth move through her chest. "And why did you stop?" she said. "Because I wasn't sure you'd want me to ask," he said. "And I didn't want to make your building site uncomfortable. It was your project, and I didn't want to be the kind of man who makes a woman's project about himself." She looked at him. Something about the care in that, the specific quality of his restraint, that he had held back not because he was uncertain of his feelings but because he was thinking about her experience, hit her in a place that had not been touched in a very long time. "I would have wanted you to ask," she said. "I would have wanted to know sooner." He exhaled, and the tension in his shoulders released in a way she could visibly see. "That's good information," he said, and his voice was quieter now and warmer, and the corner of his mouth had moved. "Yes," she said, "it is." Beatrice Holt's voice rang out from across the room announcing that the cake was being served in the yard, and the small spell of their doorway world was interrupted by the general movement of people toward food. But Clyde's hand found hers briefly in the confusion, a single brief press of his fingers, and she held on for just a moment before the crowd moved them apart. She spent the rest of that September afternoon aware of him, across the gathering the way you are aware of a warm fire in a room, even when you are not looking directly at it. The school opened on the second Monday of September with 14 enrolled students, ranging from 6 to 13 years of age, and a teacher Theodora had hired through a correspondence with an educational placement agency in Topeka. Her name was Miss Abigail Wright. She was 24 years old. She had trained at a normal school in Ohio, and she arrived on the Caldwell Creek stage with 2 trunks of books and a complete absence of intimidation by her new circumstances that Theodora found immediately admirable. Miss Wright met the schoolhouse with a clear, bright assessment and said, "This is a very well-built structure. The light is excellent. Who designed it?" "I did," Theodora said. Miss Wright looked at her with the direct attention of a fellow professional. "Splendid," she said. "We'll get along well." They did get along well. Theodora handled the administrative and physical maintenance of the building, and Miss Wright handled the teaching, and the 2 women established a working partnership that operated on mutual respect and clear communication, which was efficient and pleasant. Marcus Turner was enrolled as the eldest student, and Theodora was quietly gratified to observe that Within 2 weeks, Miss Wright had identified him as the student in the room with the most exceptional aptitude for abstract thinking, and had begun challenging him with more advanced materials. Marcus took to it like water running downhill, the path simply becoming clear. Clyde came to bring Marcus and Peter to school each morning and pick them up each afternoon, and on most mornings he stayed for an hour or two working on various improvements to the property that Theodora kept finding she needed done. And on most afternoons when he collected the boys, he stayed until the evening rather than leaving immediately. She stopped pretending not to notice this pattern, and he stopped pretending it was accidental. There was an afternoon in mid-September when they were replacing a fence post that had rotted along her east fence line, a task that had nothing to do with the schoolhouse and everything to do with the fact that they had both discovered they were most comfortable together when they were working on something side by side. She was tamping the soil around the new post with a bar while he held the post plumb, which required him to stand very close to where she was working, and she became conscious of the physical proximity of him, the breadth of his shoulders and the warmth that came off his skin in the autumn afternoon, with a specificity that made her hands slightly less steady than usual. "I've been thinking," she said, to give herself something to do with the awareness. "Tell me," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said about the boundary conditions," she said. She tamped the soil firmly. "I understand the principle. I'm interested in the application." She heard his breathing change very slightly. "Are you?" he said. "Yes," she said. She tamped the post again. "I believe in stating things directly. I find it more efficient than the alternative." "So do I," he said. "Then I'll tell you directly that I have developed a significant attachment to you," she said, "which is a thing I did not expect or plan for, but which appears to be a fact regardless. And I find that I would like to understand it better if you have any interest in that project." There was a silence. Then, "Theodora, yes. Would you look at me for a moment?" She set down the tamping bar and straightened and looked at him. He was still holding the fence post because he was a responsible man, but he was looking at her with such directness and warmth that she felt it like sunlight. "I have more than an interest," he said. "I have been trying to find the right way to tell you that since approximately the 4th day of knowing you." She looked at him. "The 4th day," she said. "You sent Ezra Dunmore away with a look," he said, "like he was an inconvenient fly. And I thought, I want to spend a great deal more time around this woman." She felt laughter rise in her, genuine and surprised, and it came out of her with a freedom she hadn't expected. He was smiling at her, a full smile this time, not the careful near smile she'd seen before, and it transformed his face entirely. She had known he was a good-looking man in the way that one knows a factual thing, but his full smile was something else. It was the kind of smile that made a person want to say something worth smiling about so they could see it again. "We can finish the fence post," she said. "We can," he agreed. "And then I think we should have supper together," she said. "All 4 of us. You and the boys and me. We've been dancing around it long enough." "I'll agree to that on one condition," he said. "Name it." "Let me cook," he said. "You've fed us enough suppers. I make a very respectable beef stew." She considered this. "If it's not respectable, I'll tell you." "I'd expect nothing less," he said. She picked up the tamping bar. He held the fence post straight. They finished it together in the long autumn light. The supper was held at her farmhouse, and Clyde's beef stew was, in fact, very respectable. He had brought the ingredients on the wagon and cooked on her kitchen stove, while she and Peter set the table and Marcus sat nearby doing arithmetic problems from his school workbook. The kitchen smelled like browned meat and onions, and the particular warmth of a wood stove in early autumn. And Theodora sat in her own kitchen watching a man cook at her stove, and felt something settle around her like a familiar coat, warm and correctly fitted. Peter, who had no internal censor of any kind, announced while eating his 3rd spoonful of stew that he thought Miss Keller should marry his father, because then they could all live together, and the commute to school would be much shorter. The table went silent. Clyde's fork stopped. Theodora looked at Peter, who was looking at her with complete guileless expectation, and then she looked at Clyde, who was looking at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. "That is a very practical argument," she said to Peter, keeping her voice entirely even. "I thought so," Peter said, and went back to his stew. Clyde very carefully cleared his throat and picked up his fork again, and she saw the red in his ears that was his tell, and she found that she was deeply delighted. Marcus, from across the table, looked up from his stew with the expression of someone who has noticed something interesting but is too dignified to comment. He looked at his father. He looked at Theodora. He went back to his supper, and the small, satisfied compression of his mouth was something she found herself filing away as an extremely good piece of data. The autumn moved forward, golden and dry, and the schoolhouse became the thing Theodora had believed it could be. Miss Wright was an excellent teacher who prepared her lessons thoroughly and kept the classroom a genuinely interesting place, and the children who came attended with a consistency that spoke well of both their families' values and their own genuine enthusiasm. Marcus Turner was reading 2 years above his level by October. Peter Turner, who had the maddening common sense of an 8-year-old who has grown up largely without formal academic constraints, discovered that he liked numbers when they were attached to practical things like measuring and calculating area, which Theodora suspected was the most direct route to his mathematical future. From the town, things were quieter. Harlan Pruitt had retreated from active interference, possibly because Corbett the lawyer had made clear there was no legal ground to stand on, or possibly because the school's existence had already become a community fact by the time he might have considered another approach. People from Caldwell Creek had started sending their children to Theodora's school as well, making the daily ride or walk from town, and the roster had grown from 14 to 21 students by November. The school was a success by any measure that mattered, and success is the most effective rebuttal to small men with small motives. Clyde and Theodora walked the boundary of her claim on a late October afternoon, which had become a thing they did on Sundays when the weather permitted, a slow circuit of the land while the boys did whatever boys did in the hours between Sunday church and Sunday supper. The cottonwood trees along the creek had gone yellow, and the grass had gone to winter brown, and the sky above the Kansas plains was an enormous ceramic blue, the color of the deep cold that was beginning to arrive in the mornings. Their breath made small clouds. They had been talking about land improvement, specifically about the possibility of running water from the creek to a holding tank that could serve both her farmhouse and the schoolhouse, which was a project she'd been turning over in her mind. But the conversation had drifted, as their conversations tended to do, into something more personal, and Clyde was telling her about the land in Missouri he'd grown up on, and the way his father had smelled of tobacco and saddle oil, and the particular color of the light on Missouri summer mornings that was different from Kansas, and that he sometimes missed without being able to say exactly why. She was listening to him the way she listened to problems she found genuinely interesting, with her whole attention and with a real desire to understand rather than simply to receive information. "Do you miss Missouri?" she asked. "Sometimes I miss the version of myself who lived there," he said. "The one who hadn't had anything hard happen yet. But that person didn't know anything." He looked out across her land, the brown grass and the yellow trees and the big sky. Clara chose Kansas. Marcus was born here. Peter was born here. He paused. "This is home now. The missing is just missing. It's not regret." She understood this distinction in the specific way that she understood things, which meant she understood it completely. She had her own version of it. Her father's voice was something she missed constantly. The life she'd imagined before his illness, the life with more ease in it, that was a thing she didn't miss exactly, because she was proud of what she had built in the harder version. But she missed who she had been when she still had him. "I think missing and regret are two entirely different geographies," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." They walked in silence for a while, and then he stopped walking and turned to her, and she stopped too, and they were standing in the winter gold grass with the big Kansas sky above them and the cottonwoods burning yellow behind her, and she knew before he said anything that something was about to shift. "I'm not good at saying things the graceful way," he said. "I've got the content but not always the delivery." "I prefer content," she said. "You know that." "I love you," he said. "That's the content. I love you for your mind and your stubbornness, and the way you looked at Harlan Pruitt's lawyer like he was a minor inconvenience. I love you for what you built, this whole actual building, with your own hands and your own knowledge, because you decided it needed to exist. I love you because you are the most capable and honest person I have ever stood next to, and standing next to you makes me want to be better at everything, including being honest." He paused. "And I would like very much to marry you if you are open to that possibility. But I understand if you want time, or if you have objections, or if you want to analyze it further before deciding." She looked at him for a long moment in the golden autumn light. Her heart was doing what it always did when he was close, that strong particular emphasis. "I don't need more time," she said. "I've been thinking about this since approximately the afternoon we set the fence post." His breath came out in a cloud. "And, yes," she said, "those are my boundary conditions. Yes is the result." He reached out and took her hand, both hands, and she let him. And she looked up at his face, and his gray-green eyes were full of something warm and uncomplicated and certain. And he bent his head and kissed her for the first time in the winter gold Kansas grass, very gently, in the way of a man who understands the weight of a first time and wants to honor it. She kissed him back in the way of a woman who has decided and means it. They were married in December of 1878. A small ceremony in the church in Caldwell Creek performed by the minister, who had been quietly sympathetic to Theodora's school project from the beginning. A gentle-spoken man named Reverend Aldrich, who said the words over them with a warmth that made them feel like promises rather than obligations. Beatrice Holt was there with her family, and Ingrid Carlson, and Dolores Reyes, and Miss Abigail Wright, and 21 children and their families who had been showing up to the schoolhouse every morning, and Clyde's 2 ranch hands, Garrett and Tolley, who stood at the back in their good hats with their arms crossed and expressions of profound satisfaction, as men do when something they have watched happen finally arrives at its correct conclusion. Marcus and Peter Turner stood with their father at the front of the church, which was their idea and not anyone else's instruction, and when Reverend Aldrich asked if anyone had objection, Peter said loudly that he did not, and that in fact he thought this was a very good idea. Marcus said nothing, but he had a composed and peaceful expression that Theodora found more moving than any speech. She wore her best dress, dark blue wool with cream lace at the collar, which she had owned for 3 years and which still fit perfectly, because she had no patience for garments that required constant adjustment. Clyde wore a suit that Garrett had pressed for him that morning with such aggressive enthusiasm that the creases were visible from across the room, and he looked so earnest and so honest in it, with his big shoulders and his weather-darkened face and his gray-green eyes finding hers across the small church, that she felt something in her chest that was not capable of being reduced to language. She said the words. He said the words. They were married. The celebration afterward was held in the schoolhouse, which was the only building in the area large enough, and which Beatrice had spent the previous day decorating with pine boughs and dried flower arrangements, and someone's grandmother's collection of tin candle holders, so that the classroom where children learned their letters by day was transformed by evening into a place filled with lamplight and the smell of pine, and the sound of a fiddle played by Ingrid Carlson's husband Lars, who was not technically proficient but was enthusiastically committed. People danced on the schoolhouse floor. Peter danced with Ingrid Carlson's youngest daughter, who had become his particular friend. Marcus danced with Miss Wright in the polite and slightly formal manner of a boy who has been taught that dancing is a social grace to be performed correctly. Clyde danced with Theodora. He was a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him. He said his mother had insisted on it, which she found charming. She was a better dancer than he had expected, and she told him without ceremony that she had practiced for 3 evenings in her kitchen in the weeks before the wedding to make sure she did it well, which made him laugh so fully that other people turned to look. They danced until late in the evening, until Peter fell asleep against Garrett's shoulder and had to be carried to the wagon, until the candles had burned low, and the celebration had gentled into the satisfied quiet of people reluctant to let a good thing end. Clyde walked beside her wagon as she drove it the short distance from the schoolhouse to her farmhouse, because the night was clear and cold, and he said he wanted to be outside for a little longer, and she understood this was another version of what she herself felt, which was that this particular evening deserved to be lived all the way to its end without hurry. At the farmhouse door he paused, his boys already abed in the additional room she had prepared for them, and he looked at her in the lamplight from the open door with an expression that was simple and certain and full. "Theodora Turner," he said. She had decided to take his name alongside her own, Theodora Keller Turner, which she had announced to the Reverend as a single composite name, and which the Reverend had recorded correctly, because she found she wanted both the continuity of her father's legacy and the reality of what was beginning. "Clyde Turner," she said back. He took her hand and they went inside, into the warm light and the small particular world of their beginning. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a proper Kansas winter, with 3 significant snowstorms, and cold that drove itself through every gap and poorly chinked wall in the territory. Theodora's schoolhouse held its heat well, because she had built the walls thick and the windows sealed tight, and only on the most brutal days did Miss Wright decide that conditions made travel too dangerous and send word to families to keep their children home. Clyde moved his 2 ranch hands and his livestock operation into a more integrated arrangement with Theodora's homestead, a process that was more logistically complex than the wedding had been, but that also went smoothly, because they were both people who approached problems systematically. They consolidated the milk herd with his cattle for winter efficiency and put the animals in Theodora's well-built barn, which was large enough. They combined their food stores and their fuel wood and ran the 2 operations as one, which made both more viable than either had been alone. Marcus and Peter adapted to life in Theodora's farmhouse with the practical flexibility of children who had grown up on the frontier, where adaptability was simply a survival characteristic. Peter immediately began treating her house as his own in the most concrete terms, which meant leaving his boots exactly where they were most inconvenient, and conducting science experiments with kitchen ingredients that resulted in at least 2 unforgettable smells, and 1 explosion of baking soda that still had traces on the ceiling in February. Marcus reorganized the bookshelves in the parlor into what he described as a logical system, and which Theodora examined carefully and acknowledged was, in fact, more logically organized than her previous arrangement. She found that she loved both boys with a specificity and ease that she had not expected, and that she did not try to analyze too carefully, because some things were more accurately experienced than examined. In March of 1879, the winter releasing its grip in stages as Kansas winters always do, slow and grudging, she told Clyde on a Sunday evening after the boys were abed that she believed she was pregnant. She told him the same way she told him anything factual, directly and clearly, sitting across the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of coffee. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and then the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, a kind of complete openness without any of his usual careful assessment, just something enormous and warm and deeply alive. "Are you certain?" he said. "I'm a careful observer," she said. "I'm fairly certain." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it with both of his, the same way he had held it in the grass on that October afternoon, and he looked at her with those gray-green eyes that had become the most familiar landscape of her daily life. "How do you feel," he asked, "about this, truly?" She considered it honestly the way she considered everything. "Glad," she said, surprised though I shouldn't be, glad more than anything else. "Me too," he said. He pressed her hand. "Very glad." She felt warmth move through her. That was neither the coffee nor the kitchen stove. The school year continued through its spring term with 23 enrolled students, which was 4 more than the autumn had begun with. In April, something unexpected happened. 3 families arrived from the South, homesteaders who had relocated from Texas following the difficulties of the late 1870s, and 2 of those families had children who joined the school. Miss Wright welcomed them and adjusted her classroom logistics with admirable efficiency. But the 3rd family included a man named Oscar Greenfield, who arrived in Caldwell Creek with money from an undisclosed source and immediately began cultivating a friendship with Harlan Pruitt. And within 2 weeks, Theodora was hearing that the 2 of them were discussing the possibility of establishing a competing school in the town proper, one that would be under the control of the council and would serve only children whose families met certain qualifications. The qualifications were not specified but were understood. Theodora considered this information for 2 days. Then she wrote a letter to the state superintendent of public instruction in Topeka outlining the educational situation in Caldwell Creek, the existing school, its enrollment numbers and academic progress under Miss Wright's instruction, and the threat of a competing political establishment that would divide community resources and potentially exclude certain children. She mailed the letter on a Wednesday. She received a response 3 weeks later. The state superintendent, a man named Thomas Wells, wrote that the state of Kansas was in the process of implementing a county school district system, and that existing schools with established enrollment and qualified teachers would be given priority consideration for district incorporation. He enclosed the application materials. She filled out the application herself, documented everything, attached Miss Wright's teaching credentials and her own architectural drawings of the building and the property deed. She submitted it by return mail. The Caldwell Creek District School, formally incorporating Theodora's schoolhouse on her property under the name Creek Road District School No. 7, was approved in June of 1879. With district status came a small but real annual appropriation from the State Education Fund, enough to cover Miss Wright's salary and the school's basic operating costs, which meant the school was no longer dependent on Theodora's personal finances alone. When the official letter of district incorporation arrived, she read it at the kitchen table while Clyde stood behind her and read over her shoulder. When she finished reading, he made a sound that was not quite a word, a long exhaled something that contained everything he thought about it, and then he put his hands on her shoulders and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Harlan Pruitt and Oscar Greenfield's school proposal quietly disappeared from discussion after that. Her son was born in October of 1879. They named him James William Turner, James for Clyde's father and William for Theodora's, which was a fact she told Clyde in the early weeks of her pregnancy, and that he held with the care she had come to understand he gave to things that mattered to him. The birth was attended by a midwife named Mrs. Ferrara from the settlement east of town, who was steady and calm and experienced. And while it was a long and difficult labor, as first labors often are, Theodora came through it with characteristic determination, and James was born before midnight on the 9th of October, healthy and loud, and vehemently opposed to the temperature difference between where he had been and where he now was. Clyde held his son for the first time in the lamplight of the bedroom he and Theodora shared, and she watched him from the bed, exhausted and aching and more satisfied than she had words for, as this large, steady man stood holding this extremely small person and looking at him with something that was beyond description. After a moment, James stopped screaming, whether because he had run out of breath or because something about the warmth and the steady heartbeat of the man holding him communicated safety, and Clyde looked up at Theodora with his eyes bright and his jaw working around something he was trying to organize into language. "Hello, James," he said instead to his son. And then to her, "You are extraordinary." "He's the extraordinary one at the moment," she said. "Yes," he said, "but you built him, the same way you build everything, with precision and intention and your whole self." She reached out her hand and he came to sit beside her on the bed, careful of the space she needed, and put James into the crook of her arm. And she held her son and looked at her husband and felt the specific deep satisfaction of a life that had become, through her own stubborn effort and considerable unexpected love, something she had not dared to fully imagine when she had stood alone outside the town hall in June of 1878, with rolled drawings under her arm, and 5 men's laughter receding through the door. Marcus, when he met James the following morning, examined him with the thorough attention of someone assessing a new and interesting phenomenon, and declared him small but correctly proportioned. Peter announced that he was going to teach James to climb trees, which Theodora said could wait approximately 5 to 7 years, and Peter said he would mark it in his calendar, which he did not own. The Creek Road District School No. 7 continued to grow. By the spring of 1880, it had 31 enrolled students, and Miss Wright had requested a teaching assistant, a request Theodora processed through the district application form she had memorized by this point, and the assistant was approved and hired by July. The schoolhouse, which Theodora had built to accommodate 30 students, was approached with an annexation question by the late summer of that year. She drew the plans for the addition herself, on winter evenings with James asleep in his cradle nearby, and the lamp burning on her drawing table, and the addition was framed the following spring by Clyde and Garrett and Tolley, and a new ranch hand named Esperanza who turned out to have more construction experience than any of them. Life on the homestead ran forward with the combination of difficulty and richness that the frontier offered without discrimination. There were hard harvests and good harvests. There was a drought summer that cost them several weeks of worry and some of the wheat crop, and a recovery the following year that made up the difference. One of Clyde's best horses came down with a respiratory sickness in the winter of 1881, and they lost him, which was a genuine grief because he had been the paint horse Clyde had ridden up her lane for the first time, and the absence of that horse in the morning pasture had a quality that both of them acknowledged quietly and did not dwell on beyond what it deserved. In 1880, they had a second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose Turner, Clara for Clyde's first wife, and Rose for the wild prairie roses that had been blooming along the creek when Theodora had gone into labor, and which she had been watching from the bedroom window between contractions. Clyde held the name Clara with the same care he held all things that mattered, and Theodora had offered it knowing that the naming was not an erasure but an honoring, a way of keeping something that deserved to be kept. He had looked at her when she suggested it with an expression she had by then catalogued as the deepest version of his love, the one he wore when she did something that reached past all his preparation and landed directly. Clara Rose was a red-haired child, like Peter, and like Peter she had a quality of constant, astonished engagement with the world around her, as though everything was brand new and worth investigating at maximum volume. She was James's favorite person by the time he was walking, following her around the farmhouse with the devoted concentration of a child who has found his anchor. Marcus Turner was 13 in 1882, and already the subject of discussion between his father and Theodora about the question of his education beyond what Creek Road No. 7 could offer. He had long since gone past what Miss Wright was able to teach him at the elementary level, and he was being supplemented with Theodora's own collection of books and with correspondence study materials she had obtained through the state education office. The question of a secondary school, of a real academic path for this boy who had read Oliver Twist to his dying mother and had never stopped reading since, was not yet solved, but it was being actively worked. The question was resolved in an unexpected way, which frontier life tended to provide. A church organization from Ohio established a secondary school in Wichita in 1882, a genuine academy with a faculty of 4 teachers and a 2-year course of study, and they offered a small number of scholarship places to exceptional students from the outlying territories. Theodora wrote a letter of recommendation for Marcus that ran to 6 pages and contained a precision of observation and a warmth of advocacy that she had not known she was capable of until she wrote it. Marcus was awarded a scholarship. He departed for Wichita in September of 1882, 14 years old, with 2 trunks of books and his mother's talent for quiet, decisive living and his father's steady way of standing in the world. At the stage stop in Caldwell Creek, Peter cried and insisted he wasn't crying and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and called Marcus a know-it-all, which was Peter's version of "I will miss you more than I can say." Marcus put his hand on his brother's shoulder and said, "Come visit at Christmas," and then he looked at Theodora. "I wouldn't be going anywhere," he said, "if you hadn't built that school." He said it quietly with the factual precision of a boy who had learned it from the woman standing in front of him. She felt something large and complete move through her. "You would have found your way," she said. "You were always going to find your way." "Maybe," he said, "but this way is better." He hugged her briefly and with dignity, and then he climbed onto the stage and was gone toward the horizon and the future. The years that followed were full. Peter grew into a broad-shouldered young man with his father's look and his own particular genius for mechanical things. And at 16, he had rebuilt the creek water system that Theodora had first designed in a way that made it 30% more efficient, which she acknowledged without any attempt to minimize it, because it was the correct response to good work. He eventually took over a good deal of the ranch operation, as Clyde's attention broadened with the expansion of their combined holdings, and he did it with the comfortable authority of a person doing something that fits them. James grew up in the schoolhouse as much as in the farmhouse, spending his early years underfoot while his mother worked on school administration and his later years as one of its students, and there was never a question about what he cared about, which was building things and how they worked. By 12, he was following Theodora around her drawing table asking questions that required real answers, and she gave them. He was going to be an engineer, she thought, watching him. He was going to build things. Clara Rose became a schoolteacher, which surprised no one. She had her father's gift for the kind of presence that made people feel steady, and her mother's intolerance for imprecision, and she returned to Creek Road District School No. 7 at 22 as a qualified teacher under the successor to Miss Wright, who had married a farmer from south of town in 1884 and retired from teaching, and the school continued in good hands with a continuity that felt, to Theodora, like something planted in the right soil, finally bearing the fruit it had always been capable of. Harlan Pruitt eventually sold his saloon and left Caldwell Creek in 1885, relocated to Dodge City, where a different kind of enterprise awaited him. The town council reformed twice over the following decade with new members and a different character, and by 1887, the council itself formally requested that Creek Road District School No. 7 be absorbed into a new town-funded school system, which would include a new building in Caldwell Creek proper. Theodora negotiated the terms of this transfer herself, ensuring the continuity of Miss Wright's successor and the guarantee that all children regardless of family circumstances would be admitted without condition. She signed the transfer papers at the same table in the same town hall where Harlan Pruitt had cracked the gavel on the oak edge and laughed at her in June of 1878. The room smelled the same. The ceiling was the same low-beamed height, but the 5 men at the table were different men, and they watched her sign with expressions of something that was not amusement at all. She walked out of the town hall and into the afternoon light, and Clyde was waiting on the boardwalk outside, because she had told him where she would be and he had come, as he consistently did when she needed the particular kind of company that didn't require explanation. He looked at her face. How was it? Completely satisfying, she said. He offered his arm and she took it, and they walked together down the main street of Caldwell Creek in the September afternoon, past the place where his paint horse had stood that first morning, past the telegraph office from which Ezra Dunmore had eventually retired, past the church where Reverend Aldrich still preached on Sundays, into the dusty golden light of a Kansas fall that was the same light as every other Kansas fall they had walked through together. Endless and clear and indifferent in the most beautiful way, stretching out flat and enormous in every direction and containing all of it. The schoolhouse and the law and the fence posts, and the stew and the winter grass and the children and the years and the daily particular fact of two people who had chosen each other and gone on choosing every morning, in the practical and complete and irreplaceable way of people who know exactly what they have. On the drive home that evening, the wagon rolling east on the creek road in the last of the light, Clyde said, "Are you thinking about what's next?" She looked at the road ahead. "Always," she said. "And James has been asking about an engineering program in Lawrence," she said. "I think we should help him get there." "Agreed," he said. "What else?" she considered. "The County Road Commission has been doing the survey on the North Track incorrectly for 2 years. I've been watching them. The error is going to cause flooding issues in 5 years when the creek runs high in spring." He looked at her with that expression she had catalogued years ago, the one that was large and genuine and never quite said enough. "Are you going to tell them?" "I'm going to write them a letter with the correct survey data," she said, "and probably the complete calculations for the drainage infrastructure they should have built in the first place. And if they don't listen." She smiled, and it was the particular smile she had, quiet and certain and direct, the one that had first appeared on that October afternoon in the winter gold grass when he had said he loved her, and she had said yes. "Then we'll handle it," she said. He took her hand on the wagon seat, his large, steady hand around hers, and the horse moved along the creek road in the evening, and the cottonwoods flickered yellow in the last light, and the prairie went on in every direction, vast and free, and full of everything that stubborn, capable, loving people had built inside of it. Ahead, in the corner of her land where the schoolhouse stood quiet in the dusk, the windows had begun to catch the first stars. She had built it, all of it, and it was enough, and it was everything.